My name is Noura Bittarki. I'm the co-founder of Aeon Collective, a nonprofit entity that advocates for sustainable practices for inclusive and equitable development through policy-relevant research and dialogue. We manage and direct multiple programs under the collective, and we are active across several focus areas that have implications on socioeconomic sustainability, including but not limited to climate and energy. I'm happy to see a lot of familiar names and faces here today and a lot of new faces, which is exactly what I was hoping for. I think we have a good group of subject matter experts and decision makers, thinkers from within the energy ecosystem as well as beyond that. Just to recap, the purpose of our workshop today is to discuss an underexplored and often misunderstood climate policy tool. Carbon pricing and carbon markets have always been a part of the policy debate on a global level, but never fully explored in the context of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's often misunderstood as a concept subject to multiple interpretations or seen as a single solution to addressing climate change. And so it becomes difficult to assess its role in developing local industries and promoting innovation without fully understanding the concepts surrounding it and distinguishing between the theoretical concept of carbon pricing and the implementation options and pathways for integrating it into regulatory laws and frameworks. Of course, on the other hand, it's equally important not to think of carbon pricing in isolation, where climate change is only treated as a market externality or an externality, but rather looking at it as a systems problem that requires the integration of multiple sectors and industries. Carbon pricing in of itself is not sufficient to achieve neutrality goals on its own, but part and parcel of a set of coherent and sequenced policies and regulations that consider the political, economic, social realities on the ground that are unique to national circumstances of nations. And so in effect, explicit carbon pricing options is one component of an integrated approach to climate, energy, and industrial policy design. With net zero commitments doubling globally over the past year and carbon pricing covering multiple jurisdictions across the globe, there's an inherent opportunity for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to deliver on the ambition of the circular carbon economy and develop the technologies that will both assist other countries in reaching their goals, as well as support the Kingdom in achieving a balance between the need to simultaneously sustain oil demand as well as manage emissions to achieve its development ambition and economic diversification goals. And so the purpose of this workshop is really to bring key actors together, provide the opportunity to put forward practical questions about implementation to experienced policymakers, and to start a dialogue and set in motion a process that would ultimately inform policy design in a decisive way. We'll be discussing how carbon pricing could play a role in accelerating the development of low carbon technologies and activities, as well as key challenges, risks, and considerations that must be explored when looking at options for carbon pricing to ensure industrial and economic competitiveness on a national level. And so with that, I'm delighted to pass the floor to my colleagues and my esteemed colleague, Professor Just Al-Baki, who will be presenting some of these core concepts and discussing some of these options.
Thank you very much, Princess Noura Al Saud. Good afternoon to all of you. It's a real pleasure to meet with you, unfortunately, not in real life, but through the screen, but nevertheless, really excited to have this opportunity to share views about what future climate action could bring to different nations, and in this case, to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I have been deeply involved in policymaking on climate issues in the European Commission. I was the Director General for more than 8 years of the DG on climate action, and I'm currently at the European University Institute in Italy, Florence. And I think, as the Princess has been sketching out in a very important manner, we are not here to discuss any issue related to the international negotiations, but we are here to discuss policies that can bring down greenhouse gas emissions within a national framework. I'm not doing this together. Many people of my team are here, and I'm going to introduce them one by one when they introduce the slides. So let's not spend too much time on that. But I would like to highlight that we are doing this exercise thanks to the efforts of the European Commission and the German GIZ, the Ministry of Environment. And we are doing this together with CPLC, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. And for that reason, I would like to hand over the floor to Angela Churi-Calgo, who has been leading this coalition for some time now. So over to you, Angela.
Thank you very much, Jos. Thank you, Princess Noura, and thank you to all the colleagues who have joined us this morning. For us from the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, it really is an honor to collaborate both with the European University Institute as well as with the Aeon Collective in this series of workshops that we're going to have looking at carbon pricing and carbon markets. Just a couple of words on the CPLC. This is a voluntary global initiative that is housed at the World Bank. We have our mandate really is to bring together stakeholders from the public, the private sector, as well as from academia, as well, all stakeholders who are interested in promoting climate action by putting a price on carbon. So we use the opportunities we can engaging with stakeholders around the world to not only share lessons, discuss challenges that they may have faced, explore solutions to some of these challenges with a view to not only inspiring action, informing further, should I say, activities or steps that could be taken, and most importantly, helping identify opportunities where we can collaborate together. So we're really looking forward to a very interesting exchange during these workshops. We hope that out of this, we will be able to find ways to work together. And as Princess Noura said at the beginning, to see how to take forward climate action, including through putting a price on carbon. So at this point, and without further ado, I'll pass back to Jos, and thank you once again.
Well, thank you, Angela. Thank you very much. And I should underline that we are looking forward to a very open and frank exchange of views. And for that reason, we are solidly following the Chatham House rules. We are not recording the discussion. We will be recording the presentations, but not the discussion. And so we will not quote to anybody outside of our little group that we are bringing together today, any information that may come out of this discussion. So Chatham House rules and no recording of the discussion. May I then forward to the next point of the agenda to Princess Noura and Princess Mashal to highlight to us the circular carbon economy concept as it was developed for Saudi Arabia. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Noura, if you allow me, I'll take this one. And I just want to make sure that everyone is seeing my screen. Is it clear?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay, fantastic. So I don't want to take too long because I think most of our people who've joined the call are very familiar with the concept of the circular carbon economy, but I'll give it a brief overview. So what does it mean when we're thinking about this, the concept of the circular carbon economy? Well, it builds on the pillars of the circular economy, where operating systems are transformed from the linear structures into something that's more circular, mirroring nature's biological cycle, and quite obviously focusing very heavily on carbon. So what are the 4 R's of the circular carbon economy? Well, in addition to the 3 R's of the circular economy, the reduce, the reuse, the recycle, a 4th R was added to think of how to deal with resident emissions, either in the atmosphere or within systems. So in Saudi, when we're thinking about reduce, we're thinking reduce the amount or concentrations of carbon-based greenhouse gases emitted to the atmosphere. Once captured, that carbon can be reused and without changing its chemistry, or recycled into more maybe differentiated products that have different chemical characteristics. And the final part, the remove, would either be partial, so it could be reused or recycled, or fully under what we would call carbon banking or storage. So I'll give a very brief example, that of the natural gas power plant. And if we're thinking of it on the reduced component, well, if we use the Allen cycle, for example, turbine, that almost allows us to capture all, if not most, of the carbon that's associated with natural gas. And that captured carbon could either be reused, pumped into greenhouses, maybe in the back to enhance growth of plants, or sent to our colleagues in SABIC to develop polymers. Or if we decide to store it, then we would go to the storage in one of multiple uses. So very briefly, I'll touch on this point where I'd love to elaborate on maybe a bit in the discussion. Is one point is that not all removal is made equal. So when we're thinking carbon storage versus carbon banking, what's the difference? Carbon storage is done over centuries. So you could think of pumping it into saline formations, pumping it into old reservoirs, or depleted reservoirs, carbon mineralization, maybe through natural sinks like whales that would allow it to stay for longer periods. Or you think of carbon banking for plants or mangroves, etc. And with that, I'll wrap up and give the floor back to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Princess Mashal. I think it's good to clarify a lot of recent developments and definitions that are being used, because we are a little bit bombarded, I'd say, with lots of announcements on net zero, climate neutral, carbon neutral, by companies, by countries, and this may just become even more active when we move up to COP26 in Glasgow. So I would like to invite Mrs. Rebecca Lamas, who is Research Associate at the EUY, to clarify a few key decisions and definitions that may come forward. But before doing that, if I can go a slide earlier, may I invite, that is what I wanted to introduce to you. In fact, before we go into the definitions, we plan to have 2 webinars. And this webinar is about the circular carbon economy and the options for carbon pricing. So as I announced, we are going to go into the definitions, into options for carbon pricing, such as carbon markets, such as offsets, domestic offsets, international offsets. Of course, we are going to talk about the EU, but we also have the presence of Shannon Phillips from Canada, from the province of Alberta, who is going to tell us about their climate policies and carbon pricing in Canada. And then we are also going to open up the issue of integrating climate, energy, and industrial policies. And then next time, next slide, please, we are going to talk more elaborately about carbon removals, about energy-related issues, new technologies, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, lots of new things happening, how to drive finance to these new technological options, which may be an issue that is also of high importance for the policies in Saudi Arabia. So we divide the work in concentrating ourselves today most on the policy options, in particular related to carbon pricing. And next time we are going to elaborate extensively on low carbon technology and innovation. So let's now move to the definitions that Mrs. Rebecca Lamas is going to introduce to us as a way to, and as a help to clarify the discussions. Rebecca, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Josh. Also, thank you, Princess Mashal and Princess Nora. Thank you all as well to the attendees and for your time. So as presented as from Josh, we think it would be interesting to give some glance on key definitions and pathways for carbon neutrality from both sectors, from the private sector commitments and also the public sector commitments. Next, please. So we start with nations that have already committed to net zero. Some are listed here, and we're definitely expecting many more in the run up to COP26. So in this time frame, running from 2035 to 2060, we see some examples. The most ambitious on the left side, Finland planning to be carbon neutral by 2035. Followed by Austria and Iceland by 2040, Sweden and the state of California by 2045. Then the most expected year of the century, 2050, we'll be seeing the US, the EU, the UK, Japan, also Korea, South Africa, New Zealand, and the states in Australia aiming at being carbon neutral, net zero by 2050, and the big player, China, planning to become carbon neutral by 2060. Aiming at picking its emissions by 2030. Also, we said we would be giving a glance on pathways. Well, the most recent one, let's give the example of China, currently working on a nationwide carbon trading scheme that will be covering the country's power sector. Is due to be launched this year, which is foreseen to be the largest, overtaking the EU ETS, as it will also be covering the maritime sector. So many things coming up. Next slide, please. Okay, so as already given as a glance by Princess Mashal, let's dive in on the circular carbon economy concept in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was already raised. Just quickly, we'll be looking at reducing, reusing, recycling, and removing. And we're expecting, after the discussions of today, to clearing up and seeing the possibilities and opportunities of the implementation of this concept in the country. Next, please. Okay, so we gave a glance on commitments and nations-wise. Also, I think it's interesting to be looking at the private sector, the voluntary carbon reporting initiatives. Where are they standing? What are they looking at? So I propose starting with ESG. It's a voluntary corporate reporting. What we see as a trend is that investors are increasingly requiring companies to provide more disclosure on environment, social, and governance factors, criteria. And also what we see clearly is that we are heading to a lower emissions future. And this is clearly seen in the concept developed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that we must have in place a future-proof oil and natural gas production, as it's definitely linked with to lower carbon facilities, as they are likely to be more resilient with less carbon tax, less environmental liability, and etc. What is important to be mentioned as well is that ESG is a concept that is still under development. What is clear for now is that ESG investing is based on the assumption that ESG metrics are non-financial metrics. They're very much working together with and changing the investment financial trends. Now, pragmatically, what does ESG means at the end of the day is an addition to the traditional corporate social responsibility reporting, the CSR. In addition to that, having sustainability features also reported in a transparent way, very much data-driven. So looking at the energy and emissions of the corporation, water and waste management, green manufacturing, overall looking at all SDGs. So this both together means an ESG reporting for at a corporation level. Next, please. Okay, so now let's look at the corporate commitments. It's very trending the last 2 years. Different corporations going net zero, carbon neutral, zero carbon, carbon negative, what all of this means, and how are they setting those targets. So on top and right left side, we see net zero and carbon neutral, internationally very much seen as the same concept, meaning that on operations of the corporation are zero emissions. So from reduction of emissions plus removals. On the left hand side, we see zero carbon. What does that mean? It's not looking at removals, but it's looking at that the corporation is fully relying on 100% on green power. So it's not looking at other emissions, not looking at removals. Then on the left, we also see carbon negative. What is that? What does that mean? So it's a net zero plus offsetting or removing more emissions than what the corporation is emitting. I think one of the most ambitious examples would be Microsoft, for example, that is aiming at being carbon negative by 2030 and removing all the historical emissions by 2050. But what does that really mean? It means that here on at the end we see scopes 1, 2, 3. The corporation in this sense, in this case, as an example, Microsoft is just looking at its own direct operations and the emissions generated by the electricity that the corporation is consuming. What is left behind and is not being committed yet by those corporations is the scope 3. So it's subcontracted services, materials, all this is being left out of the corporation's commitments. So that's why here it's very interesting, I think, to bring together commitments from the private sector with the commitments from the public sectors to be looking at the full value chain. Next one, please. Okay, as we'll also be discussing on technologies, I just added here a slide on hydrogen. Let's clear up the colors of a colorless gas. In the context of Saudi Arabia, we'll be looking mainly on the right side, the blue hydrogen, so production from natural gas, then the emissions being captured. Whereas on the left side, we see the gray hydrogen, which is the one produced from fossil fuels. We can be also categorized as brown as it comes from brown coal, or black if it comes from black coal. Then on top, very much also in the context, as I see a comment from Princess Marshall, on top we see green hydrogen, very much in the context of Saudi Arabia as well. Project Neon, as it's made with renewable electricity, but others would call it yellow hydrogen, as it's produced specifically from solar power, whereas others in other countries would call it as mixed origin. I think this is the only color there is a bit of discrepancy. But overall, there is a common understanding internationally on the colors. So yeah, in the context, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, or yellow hydrogen. Next one, please. Okay, so just to close my points, I would like to raise a couple of questions. So the first one related to the private sector, and the second one related to the public. So in a long-term, is a long-term objective such as aiming at carbon neutrality by a certain date, is it helpful for companies in the formulation of their long-term strategies? I would like to have some discussions after on this. And then the second question would be, how can the concept of the circular carbon economy from the kingdom be used as a framework for the design of climate policies and the full implementation of the targets? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this very clear overview. And we are going to store the questions for our discussion later, because after each section, we want to bring forward a few questions to enlighten and inspire the debate. Now, I will dwell a little bit on carbon markets. And on the next slide, what are carbon markets all about? Well, it is about carbon pricing. And carbon pricing is about putting a price on carbon. So that discourages the emissions of greenhouse gases, but at the same time, it encourages alternatives that are more low carbon. So that's a basic element that is not always easy to put into operation. And basically, there are two ways. You can have carbon taxes, or you could go through carbon markets. Carbon taxes, that's easy to understand. The government sets a price on carbon, and the citizens have to pay for that price of carbon, and that should act as an incentive to save on carbon. Now, the alternative is to go through markets where a maximum amount of allowed pollution is being capped. And then you let the market to discover at what price that is taking place. On the next slide, I dwell a little bit in why economists, and in particular Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus, have been advocating carbon pricing, because it cuts emissions, and it cuts emissions at the lowest cost. So macroeconomically, that's not without importance. Many would say it's an alternative to detailed technical regulation. Others would say it creates flexibility for market operators, because market operators, the companies involved, they are faced with a make or buy decision. They can make the reduction of emissions themselves and hence not having to pay for allowances, or if it is cheaper, they can buy allowances from someone else. We saw, and in particular in Europe, that it is a very helpful way of having a transition that is gradually towards the long-term objective of net zero. And that gradual nature is also applicable to the modernization of the industry. So that step-by-step approach is a very important element. On the next slide is indicated that, a cap, if it is to be set, it has to be set by a governmental authority, the state, the government, an agency, and then it is being translated towards obligations for companies. And companies then have to measure their emissions, and they have to pay allowances, they have to surrender allowances to cover for their emissions. And they make the reports about their emissions themselves, and in most cases, there is a third-party verification on that. And so the companies can decide whether they reduce the emissions themselves or they pay someone else to do so. And that principle leads to cost effectiveness and leads to reaping the low-hanging fruit first in such a way that the cheapest ways of reducing emissions are being taken by the market first. Now, on the next slide is indicated how the Europeans were establishing such a system in 2005, and we are today in 2021. So we have 15 years of history, and gradually the emissions were reduced by overall a third without reducing the overall production by the sectors covered. The European emissions trading is covering all companies in the energy sector, the power sector, and the manufacturing industry. And it covers more than 10,000 installations. So it covers almost half of the European emissions. And so this reduction by a third over 15 years is a very important element. On the next slide is shown that the price is very variable. The price is today 35 euros. It increased over the last couple of days from 33 to 35. There was a peak yesterday. So the price is significant. And what we see is that since we are over the last 3 years with significant prices in the range 25, 35 euros, we see that the emission reductions have really accelerated. And that means that old installations, in particular in coal-fired power generation, are going to be closed more quickly due to the carbon price. On the next slide, there is a question of fairness that has many appearances because exporters of energy-intensive products, they are asking for free allocation of allowances, and they get that because the carbon leakage phenomenon, we do not want that to happen. That is that because of carbon, that production is shipped out of, in this case, Europe to other places. So free allowances should help for that. There are also allowances that are being sold and separated from the rest so as to create an innovation fund. And that innovation fund with the current prices is significant. It's more than $12 billion or euros today, or to spread the investment in low carbon technology, and that's the modernization fund. Revenues of auctioning of allowances can also be used to soften regional impacts or social impacts. These have been very important political elements. Now, on the next slide is shown that carbon pricing is spreading. And in fact, this week on the 1st of February, the most important new carbon market is China. China is now developing a nationwide carbon market comparable to the one of the ETS, but other constituencies are also going into carbon pricing. We will hear from Shannon Phillips in a minute how it is developing in Canada. We know that California is having a carbon pricing system. Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, they are all going into their variations, Thailand, Vietnam. So developments are really ongoing, but the big mark is that this week, China is the biggest carbon market of the world, and that is going to have a significant impact. On the next slide, of course, we have regular reviews on the ways these ETSs are being organized, and more changes are to come. In Europe in particular, the climate neutral goal by 2050 will require a tightening up of the ETS. There is also talk about extension to more sectors, in particular heating fuels and transport fuels. And there is a raging debate on how to cope better with carbon leakage through the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That would be a tariff at the border for energy intensive products. And that is a proposal is awaited for this year, with implementation, as it is said by leaders, as of 1st of January of 2023. Now that leads to a number of questions on the next slide, which I would be happy to debate with you further. Is there a role for carbon markets in Saudi Arabia? And if there is no role for carbon markets, what would be the alternative? Because I think that the world is going to net zero, and Saudi Arabia is positioning itself into that debate. And it would be also interesting to know from the interventions what may be the most attractive element of carbon pricing. Is it a disincentive to pollution, an incentive to innovation, the cost effectiveness and the flexibility, or the revenues raised inter alia to encourage innovation? So these issues I would like to park for the debate. And without much further ado, I would like to invite Shannon Phillips from Alberta, the province of Canada, who has been developing a quite active climate policy and also an important role of pricing to introduce her comments. So without much further ado, Shannon, can I pass the microphone to you?
Well, thank you, Joss, and thanks to Angela and the whole team at the World Bank Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and thank you to Ms. Al-Saud and Ms. Shahal for helping, for pulling this together and helping set the context for this. I am currently a practicing politician, and so my comments will, of course, speak to the policy, and there's nothing I like better than a good policy conversation, but I think there are many brighter minds than me to fill in some of those blanks, and I'm seeing some of that come up in the chat. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the S in ESG, that social piece, in particular in fossil fuel producing jurisdictions, because I think, sometimes the conversation around carbon pricing in many different markets leaves out that very real reckoning with fossil fuel producing jurisdictions, those of us who are primary commodity producers, and the kinds of structural changes that are happening in our labor markets and in our economies, and how carbon pricing can hedge against some of those resilience risks for our societies, because the changes are coming whether we like them or not. So the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about a compliance market as opposed to the voluntary market. And I've seen some folks in the chat talking a little bit about that. A compliance market is where you have a legislated carbon tax. In this case, I'm going to talk about the industrial carbon tax. So let's take the lightning out of the sky about an economy-wide carbon tax where, we're having to have that conversation with direct consumers. And let's just talk about our industrial producers for a moment, because in an economy like ours, it's a subnational jurisdiction, but the vast majority of our emissions don't come from people driving down the road or heating their homes. Those, or in KSA's case, cooling their homes. Our emissions come from the industrial production and the industrial emissions at wellhead or at, for example, in our case, the mine level. So we have had an industrial carbon price with that allowance for free, with that free allowance piece for some, not all of our industrial emissions, depending on facility size, since 2008 in Alberta, far before Canada had a nationwide carbon tax, which we do now. But over a decade, we've had at least a good chunk of our industrial emissions covered by some form of carbon pricing. And we updated that system to be, I guess, to be able to talk to be able to integrate with carbon pricing systems in the industrialized world, whether it's California, Ontario and Quebec, or the EU in 2017, 2018. And so our industrial facilities, of course, the oil and gas ones were production standards that we sort of had to develop on our own. But our cement, steel, petrochemical, others are very, very analogous to what the system of free allowances and the product standards that prevail in other jurisdictions. And this was important because that level of what you're establishing as the free allowances above that or below that that standard, sorry, that's an element of competitiveness and how your offsets markets might integrate with the rest of the world or other jurisdictions that you might choose to develop relationships with. Compliance cost currently is $40 per ton, but it's not for every emission. Like Joss said, there is a system of free allowances, although we are seeing in the EU that system of free allowances being turned down over time. And that's another reason why you need to be able to send those signals to the producers of what they can expect as well. Our industrial carbon pricing started off as what one might describe as a light touch back in 2008. And in fact, you know, those of us on my side of the aisle in the legislature would have described it as too light of a touch. But it was changed in between 2015 and 2017 in order to bring it up to a level of competitiveness with the rest of the world. So you have a product-based standards. Emitters can pay into the fund if their production exceeds that standard. That is to say, they are capped at a certain level of emissions. If they can't meet that, they pay the government, or they purchase offsets in aspects of the economy that are not regulated. Or they can purchase those offsets from fellow emitters who have exceeded their compliance obligations. Very simple, straightforward system, but it's within the subnational jurisdiction, not Canada-wide, at least not yet. So the next slide. Like I said, you know, the structure of our economy is such that we had to do this. We absolutely had to. We are America's largest supplier of oil and gas. It's not, everybody thinks it's Saudi Arabia. It's not. It is the province of Alberta. But as folks in KSA understand very well, our best customers, the province of Alberta, has evolved into our biggest competitor with the advent of shale. Right. And so it has changed the game for oil and gas producers as well. Our economy is highly dependent on these exports and in some associated manufacturing and petchem endeavors. And so what that means is that as those markets change, as the global markets change, it leaves us very, very vulnerable in terms of the social disruption, labor market disruption. And that is something that we've really, really got to think about in terms of 2021 to 2020 to 2030. It's a very short period of time, as I always underline to people. This is essentially one business cycle away from a very severe disruption if we're not ready for it. But that industrial carbon tax has been a key source of revenue. So the revenue that's been reinvested has been something along the lines of about $1 billion USD in the last decade or so. Other revenues that have been recycled in have been more on the range of about $3 billion USD since about 2015. So and that government money is, at least historically, that's changed now, has been reinvested back by government into innovation, into clean tech, And that necessarily diversifies the economy, even if it's diversification within the oil and gas sector. So let's just move on. The compliance market has to be regulated. In the first instance, as I said, government has to set those production standards, but then we also have a role for the development of offset protocols in the emission trading system. And you want to, like I said, set that policy direction where your system can talk to other systems, because those mutually beneficial trading arrangements, bilaterals, are already being discussed in a number of different jurisdictions, including Canada, and we will be an exporter of those credits because of Alberta's oil and gas production. Those markets are already in existence. They're evolving very quickly, both on the compliance side and on the voluntary market side. And so they need to have integrity to them as well. So the voluntary markets piece I'm leaving aside for now, but your compliance markets within any jurisdiction have got to be appropriately resourced. They've got to match the technology development in your jurisdiction. They've got to target those lowest cost reductions. They have to be the easiest for producers to quantify and report. They can't, you'll lose a lot of your benefits of carbon pricing in terms of the development of bureaucracy and so on if your protocol system isn't, fleet of foot. It has to be additional. Therefore, it has to actually have integrity to it. There has to be a ton coming out of the sky at some point, as I always like to break it down. And it has to have that high level of measuring, reporting, verification. You have to think as policymakers of those offsets as currency. As I sometimes sort of more glibly point out, you wouldn't just not regulate your currency. Just whatever, it might be worth something, it might not be. These are complicated areas, but they must focus on that regulation of those markets. Otherwise, you lose the plot and you lose the whole point of this, which is access to markets, access to capital, and making your society more resilient. And we have learned many of those lessons. As a closed carbon trading system, the registry has to be robust. The protocol development has to be well-resourced. You have to have policies in place to mitigate the risk of, people dumping credits onto the market, these kinds of just basic market regulation tools. So moving on. So we derive value from this. And so often in carbon pricing, we're only talking about the costs and not the opportunities. Oil and gas producers obviously have to have a climate plan because you have that limitation on access to capital and access to market if you don't. There are material risks to the balance sheet without climate policy. You will push technology and innovation if you are reinvesting the revenues appropriately. In non-regulated sectors, you will have an ability to grow those. And that economic diversification, I know, is something for fossil fuel producers that is a constant source of conversation, of policymaking, and of desire on the part of the citizens for jobs. They see what happens to their jobs in those commodity price fluctuations, and it creates a great deal of uncertainty, and it's not helpful for people and quality of life. One of the things that gets missed in the diversification conversation often in fossil fuel producing jurisdictions is the extent to which reinvestment of carbon taxes drives diversification in the oil and gas sector, not just in agriculture or in waste or in technology, but in oil and gas itself. And it drives productivity in oil and gas itself. You get more out of what you're pulling out of the ground when you are rewarding some of these clean tech solutions. So we'll just move on then. And then finally, the politics of carbon pricing are really tough. But when you focus in on the advantages of industrial pricing, you can take some of the politics out of it. You can then have a conversation with people about the balance sheet proof that there's opportunity, not just cost, in acting on climate change. And there are existential risks to commodity producing jurisdictions and fossil fuel jurisdictions that are very real. I think it's important to always be communicating that, the very real risk, not just to the balance sheet, but also to people's livelihoods. As someone whose, occupational risks include looking the voters in the eye every 4 years, you have got to deal with this conversation around just transition in a way that is non-academic for people. And the way that you do that is you ensure that you are reinvesting those revenues. And with that, I will wrap up, and I can talk about some of the specific protocols, whether it's in agriculture or methane reduction in oil and gas, and some of the success stories there later on.
Thank you very much, Shannon, for this exciting elaboration of how things have developed in Alberta. And I think you highlighted the importance of regulations and the importance of the market to play out. And part of the market you were mentioning is offsets. We have prepared some slides on that, and I hand over the microphone to Robbie Watt, who is a research associate at the EUY. So Robbie, the microphone is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Joss. I'm a researcher at the European University Institute. I've researched carbon offset markets for many years. Today, I'll be explaining the fundamentals of carbon offsets and outlining the current situation of international and domestic carbon offset markets. So my aims are to set the context, to identify opportunities and challenges of offsets, and to help open up the debate about offset markets' possible future role in Saudi Arabia's climate policy mix. So next slide, please. So first of all, some fundamentals. What do we mean by an offset? How do we make an offset? Well, carbon offset credits, as Shannon said, are supposed to represent 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, reduced, avoided, or sequestered. An organization, a carbon standard, provides a methodology, and a project developer will design a project and send documents aiming to prove that they are following that methodology. If the auditor and the standard body are satisfied, carbon credits can be issued. The project developer may then sell the offset credits. These credits can be traded around, and the final owner of the offset credit will retire it. And by retiring that credit, they claim the emissions reduction. So the diagram here shows different types of carbon standards. Some are voluntary, private standards. Some are international. Some are domestic. So we talk of carbon offset markets in the plural. There are 2 main motivations to buy offsets, either to comply with climate policy. For example, in the case of Alberta, many firms will do that if offsets are included in the law. Or secondly, to make a voluntary claim. For example, if a company wants to claim that they are carbon neutral. So next slide, please. Saudi Arabia has experience of hosting offset projects. There are 6 under the UN Clean Development Mechanism, which was the biggest offset market in the world. There is 1 bilateral offset project with Japan, and there is 1 new project seeking registration under the voluntary VCS standard, a large solar plant in Al Sudair. I'm sure some of you will have knowledge of these projects. Next slide, please. In many offset markets internationally, there is a lack of demand. For example, the CDM projects registered in Saudi Arabia may now be struggling to sell the credits that they issued because of low demand, oversupply, and very low prices. It was previously possible to sell offsets from the CDM into the EU emissions trading system, but that link from the EU to the CDM was ended several years ago due to significant concerns about the environmental integrity of the credits. Many have talked also about the aviation sector being a source of demand for offsets. ICAO did agree to use offsets for its climate plan under CORSIA, but because of COVID-19 and a change in rules and the decline of the aviation sector during the pandemic, there will be no demand from airlines for several years and only relatively low demand in the years that follow, projections show. Next slide, please. So we may think that companies will buy the offsets instead. There's a lot of talk now about voluntary offset markets. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, COP26 climate finance advisor to the UK government, has been leading a task force on scaling the voluntary carbon markets, which had a report out just last week. This market could grow. The task force aims to grow it. Companies are signaling a move to net zero targets, and some of them may want to use offsets as part of that. But even if this market grows a lot, it will only grow from a very low level to start with. It is relatively small. Prices are low and credits are oversupplied. Furthermore, when it is voluntary in this way, companies may decide not to pay. And lastly, it must be noted that the controversies of offsetting, the problems of lack of quality with offsets, have not yet been resolved. And the graph here shows the surplus, the growing surplus of credits in the voluntary carbon markets. Next slide, please. So carbon offsets are controversial because they are supposed to represent this claim to achieving an emissions reduction. However, there are many different technical reasons why that claim is often not as credible as you might expect. So critics of offsetting complain that they are used by companies as a form of greenwash. Critics may also complain that offsets undermine climate policy, and that is almost like a loophole, and that is one reason why the EU gradually removed them from its carbon market. So this slide sets out technical reasons why offsets often have low quality, low environmental integrity. I won't go through them all. I just note the consequence, which is that in many people in international circles, in the media, in civil society, in policymaking circles, are skeptical towards offsets, and they do not always see them as a very credible option. Nevertheless, next slide, please. One possible option for Saudi Arabia is to explore domestic offsetting. Many countries do this, using the experience of the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, to offer support to the domestic existing CDM projects that are now struggling to access international finance, given the current lack of demand. So we see this in China, we see it in Mexico, South Africa, for examples, where domestic offset credits can be retired to count against emissions trading or carbon tax rules. We've seen something similar in Alberta, as Shannon Phillips has already told us about. So what rationales are there for domestic offsetting? It offers support for domestic projects rather than international projects. It may offer an element of flexibility to ease compliance with a carbon tax or an emissions trading system or other climate policy instruments. So next slide, please. I conclude with a few questions for you all about how you see the options for Saudi Arabia to make use of carbon offset markets. International offsets or domestic offsets, could they play a role in Saudi Arabia's climate policy mix? So thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Robbie. To elaborate, one of the modalities that Shannon was indicating from the Alberta province in Canada. But as it should be underlined that carbon pricing is always to be put in a specific institutional context, and all institutional contexts differ because they have different energy policies, industrial policies, climate policies is an add-on to that. So having a good coherence between those is very important. And Christian Egenhofer, who is a senior research associate at the EUI, is going to deal with that, how the European example could be highlighted into that. And it would be very important to widen up in the discussion how the Saudi Arabian context or the Canadian context or any other context of one of the member states of the EU that is also very different could bring forward synergies between climate, energy, and industrial policies. Christian, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Jos. Good afternoon, everybody, and very pleased and honored to address this distinguished audience. I'm also glad of being back in Saudi Arabia, even if it's virtual at this time. Jos mentioned it already. The focus is here on the policy mix, or how you integrate various elements of your economic, environmental, or climate policies into one mix. There was actually quite an active chat already on this issue, so I'm trying to pick up some of the points that have been mentioned there. Maybe I can have the next slide, please. Yeah, I would like to give an EU perspective, looking back a little bit, and also to see how this could emerge in the future, not just in the EU, but also possibly internationally, which might have some implications for Saudi Arabia. Politically, the support for EU climate policy really solidified with the integration of the climate, energy, and the industrial developments. And as you see on the left-hand side, there were different phases. We had the 2020 package with the three targets, legally binding, the energy union, now the Green Deal. As we moved from there to the Green Deal, also the integration process. There were always these three central elements of this policy mix. One was the ETS, we had heard a lot, pricing on carbon. Important was the protection of competitiveness. It was also the example of Alberta. And then, of course, the revenues. Revenues are important. In the EU, our governments collect a lot of revenues from fossil fuel use. The renewables energy policy, the strategic objective there was from the very beginning to bring costs down for the future technologies. Renewables, it's successful now. Electromobility is the next, and in the future, we talk hydrogen, green steel, green cement, and so on. We also managed to integrate the renewables now into the market, which has some very positive effects. And support of the local economy is always very important. And if I read the chat correctly, that is also one of the issues, how does it bring us advantages economically? The energy efficiency policy, again, was a way to collect cheap reduction initially, but also to keep the energy bill stable. Very important. Our energy prices, certainly in some countries, have gone up. So if households use less, then of course the energy bill stays the same. You can see this as a similar approach or a different approach to the problem that also Alberta tried to address. How do you create acceptability? You don't want to have direct big increases in costs, etc. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, when you take a bit of a higher level headline perspective, then you can see that the motivation of the EU and many of the member states was threefold. Climate change, of course, but behind very, very quickly comes the industrial policy perspective, creating new industries, renewable energy, energy efficiency, ongoing, hydrogen, we're discussing low carbon steel, cement, chemicals. That's where the debate currently stands in the European Union. The energy part was a very, very important element of it, energy security, triggered then also this concept of strategic autonomy. At the time of the start of the climate policy, the European imports were soaring. The import dependency was increasing, and all of those familiar with the US discussion, the moment of the US import dependency increasing, you get a lot of reaction. Now, I would say the gas discussion, the risk of, or the worry that we have too much import dependence on Russian gas was an element of there, even if climate change policy does not address it immediately, but it addresses it starting 2030, etc., etc. So you could call it is a kind of a resource nationalist re-nationalizing or taking control over national resources has also been part of the overall motivation. Now let's look, can I have the next slide, please? Let's look now at the purely industrial economic perspective. Leave the climate part aside. We discuss it later on. And Jos mentioned, is the carbon pricing a disincentive to emissions, or is it an incentive for innovation? And this is where the discussion in the EU is really based. Now look at the ETS. Obviously, you have a gradual, predictable, long-term orientation. That's what we are interested to have a smoother transition. We see where the things are going. Carbon pricing is very good for this. The carbon pricing helps us in our market focus, which generates in a market setting investment. Initially, this has not been the case, but now it's really catching up and you can have a lot of evidence there. And of course, it captures economic rents from oil, gas, and I should add here coal importer. First, it was redistributed to industry, power, and the industry sector, and now it's governments. The revenue side comes back again. Also, the renewables policy captures the economic rents, here more from coal and gas. And as you all recall, certainly in Saudi Arabia, we had a similar discussion already where we tried to substitute imported oil with domestic biofuels. And of course, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, we had the same discussion, being less dependent, building nuclear. Initially, the renewables policy was expensive, and Jos, you have gone through the impact assessments. You know the prices at the time when you did that. But now it's fairly successful. And I think interesting is really to mention those member states in the EU that have the most renewables have the lowest wholesale electricity prices, 20% lower than those who are having still a lot of commodities like oil, gas and coal. And then also there was quite a lot of government support because of industrial benefits, even if the policy was expensive. And there is now evidence that we can retain significant part of the value chains in renewable energy, even in solar PV, contrary to what a lot of people say. In the EU, there is examples in Poland, Germany, Romania, and Bulgaria. And I can tell you this with big honesty, because we did that study. There is some elements there. Energy efficiency policy, again, tries to capture economic rents from importers, oil and gas, substituted by EU products. And that has triggered now a discussion on, this discussion on industrial value chains. Where are these industrial value chains? Where can Europe get to there? And where can we be competitiveness? Again, a lot of government supported energy efficiency and renewables policies in addition to carbon pricing because of this local jobs and growth argument. So the three, in a way, were quite in good in balance. Let me just finish with the last slide. Having looked now at the EU internal situation, how could we look to the external? The EU as a soft power adheres, of course, to multilateralism. You all know this, and we are very much adhering to market-based and rule-based system. So in that context, we believe that carbon pricing is a good tool to keep a stable international environment, preferable to a more politicized system where you have the energy dominance and this kind of discussions we had recently from the US. So the carbon pricing, when you look at what scenario the EU would prefer, I mean, I don't have to, it's very clear that the European Union would prefer a scenario one, which has a gradual, predictable, long-term orientation, where the transition from high carbon to low carbon is driven by price and not politics and hard-nosed international relations. So therefore, a gradually globalizing carbon pricing would be very much in line also with a more smooth international transition from a more multilateral perspective. Now, there are two questions which we are currently thinking ourselves. Please, can I have the last slides? And that is, what policy mix can actually address the concerns of the energy and manufacturing industry best? We have some examples in the EU, but of course the situation in all the countries are different. And then the second question is really, can carbon pricing assist an international way, a non-disruptive, gradually and more orderly transition from a high carbon to a low carbon energy? So thank you. I will stop here. Jos, over to you.
Thank you, Christian. And this ends the introductions. A lot of food for thought